Firebase, Mary Ann perched on a bulldozed ridgeline in the highlands of Quang Tin Province, South Vietnam, 30 miles west of Chu Lai, where the jungle grew thick and the K7 corridor and Dak Rose Trail, branches of the Ho Chi Minh Trail running from Laos to the coast, carried North Vietnamese troops and supplies toward the war zones further south. The Firebase, pathetically named after the commanding officer's sister, occupied the top of a ridge close to the border of Laos, and was manned by soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment, Company C, which was part of the Americal Division. By March 1971, the Firebase stretched 500 meters along the crest of a 200-meter-high ridge, defended by 22 bunkers made from metal shipping containers called connexes, ringed by barbed wire and observation posts, housing in all 231 American soldiers and 21 South Vietnamese Army ARVN personnel. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel William P. Doyle, was a serious professional who, along with Company C Commander Captain Richard Vi Knight, had molded this handful of reluctant draftees into one of the better combat units still in the field in 1971. But by March of that year, their Firebase had fallen into a dangerous complacency that would prove catastrophic. Mary Ann was in a generally quiet sector, and the soldiers atop the hill had come to regard their outpost as something of a rear echelon area rather than what it actually was, the division's most forward fire base. In March of 1971, very few who were there wanted to be there, and the prevailing sentiment among both officers and men was to look after one's own hide while counting down the days until one could catch a freedom bird back to the States. It was a period fraught with problems, combat refusals, drug abuse, racial strife, and fraggings, and soldiers, aware of the drawdown of American forces, were resentful at risking their lives for what was perceived as a lost cause, with racial tensions increasing throughout the Army, and drugs and alcohol cheap and easy to procure. Career soldiers were looked at with disdain by draftees, and officers and non-commissioned officers who tried too hard to enforce standards risked being shot or fragged by their own troops in garrison, and it wasn't unheard of for individual soldiers or entire squads to refuse orders to go out on patrol. It was not uncommon for men sent out on ambush to avoid engaging with enemy patrols and to report they had seen nothing when the opposite was true, with some patrols openly refusing to enter certain areas where contact with the NVA seemed likely. One company, D Company, even refused to leave the wire unless supplied with scout dogs, air support, and a medevac helicopter, and men posted to guard duty at night would drift off into sleep and escape punishment. Despite that troubled environment, the U.S. soldiers had built up an impressive record outside the wire, with patrols aggressively clearing trails, fighting off ambushes, and uncovering weapons caches, earning several medals in the process. But back at the Firebase, soldiers and leaders alike maintained a relaxed attitude, particularly toward base security, with teams conducting security, often sleeping through their shifts, and officers rarely conducting checks to ensure that sentries were alert. Trip flares placed in the perimeter wire to alert guards of intruders were not maintained, and according to one soldier, claymore mines which were to be set up outside the wire before each shift were instead being discarded in the grass as useless because the soldiers had removed the flammable C4 explosive charges to heat their rations. While the Americans grew complacent, the NVA was probing the Firebase and sighting every inch of its perimeter with small arms, identifying the 22 bunkers and marking them on maps, steadily and surely, drawing up a plan of attack and waiting for the right moment to hit the indolent Americans with a coordinated assault. It was later revealed that the Firebase had been under enemy observation for 2 months. On the afternoon of March 27, 1971, after soldiers had completed their target practice, the 3 officers remained on the shooting range, where they plinked with various weapons and talked a while. And then Doyle and Knight headed for the mess tent, while Captain Paul S. Spielberg remained behind to take a few more shots. Having only the base's mascot dog for company, the mongrel suddenly bristled and began barking and growling at something downslope that Spielberg could not locate, a warning that went unheeded and unreported. On the night of March 27th, base security was in the hands of Captain Knight, but the defenses that should have protected the Firebase were effectively unmanned. And during the night of 27 to 28 March 1971, a Viet Cong sapper company infiltrated fire support base Marianne without alerting a single guard in a single perimeter bunker, setting the stage for what would become a humiliating defeat that sounded the death knell for the reputation of the once proud U.S. Army in Vietnam and the deadliest assault of the Vietnam War on a single U.S. firebase and the war's last major attack on a U.S. installation. At approximately 02:30 on March 28, 1971, 50 sappers of the 409th Viet Cong Main Force Battalion, wearing nothing but shorts, slipped through the base's barbed wire without alerting a single sentry, elite Bo Doi Dak Cong, soldiers in special forces, whose bodies were covered with charcoal dust and grease that made them almost invisible in the darkness, carrying satchel charges to destroy bunkers and command posts, AK-47 rifles for close combat, rocket-propelled grenades for hardened positions, and improvised grenades made from Coke cans filled with explosives and nails. Under the concealment of heavy fog on the night of 27-28 March 1971, the sappers quickly overran the outpost, lobbing grenades and charged satchels into structures before friendly forces had time to react. The first enemy 82mm mortar shells hit Firebase Marianne at 02:30, signaling the start of the ground attack, with accurate fire striking the Tactical Operations Center and Company Command Post on the base's southeast side, and the remaining mortar and artillery positions in the northwest area, systematically targeting the Firebase's command structure and defensive capabilities in a carefully planned assault that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the base's layout and vulnerabilities. The sappers moved through the concertina wire with practiced efficiency, snipping through the strands with wire cutters, their movements undetected by guards who were either asleep or simply absent from their posts, a failure so complete and inexcusable that it would shock investigators when the full scope of the disaster became known. Along the base perimeter, most troops had taken cover in their Conex bunkers when the mortar barrage began, following standard operating procedures for incoming indirect fire, but this allowed the sappers to close rapidly without any danger of return fire, and in many cases the enemy fighters were through the defensive lines and inside the Firebase before defenders moved from their bunkers to the sandbag trench line where they might have engaged the infiltrators. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, Captain Spielberg had been asleep when the muffled crashes of explosions jerked him awake, and running down the hallway of the Battalion Tactical Operations Center, he charged into a cloud of tear gas, just as he reached the commander's quarters, staggering blindly back the way he had come until he made it to the north exit, crawled up the stairs and out the door into the fresh but bullet-ridden air. Forcing his eyes to focus, the shaken captain was stunned to hear the fire of AK-47s and the crash of rocket-propelled grenades from inside the base's perimeter, and in amazement he watched as numerous small figures darted cat-like among the spreading flames. Everywhere, seeing the scurrying silhouettes of enemy sappers feeding the chain of explosions, devouring fire support base Mary Ann. The south end of the battalion tactical operations center was burning fiercely by this time. The fire started by a satchel charge, igniting a case of white phosphorus grenades located near the south bunker entrance, creating an inferno that blocked escape routes and filled the bunker with toxic smoke. Lieutenant Edward McKay, the TOC night duty officer, started to panic in the oven-like bunker, screaming, "We gotta get out of here," until Lieutenant Colonel Doyle, summoning his last element of strength, slapped the hysterical junior officer hard across the face and snarled, "Shut up, Lieutenant." It was now R251, and radio telephone operator David Tarnay managed to raise LZ Mildred, and when Spielberg heard Tarnay shouting into his microphone, he bounded back inside the blazing TOC, grabbed a handset, and shouted to Lieutenant Thomas Schmitz at LZ, "Mildred, I want artillery 50 meters out, 360 degrees around our position. On my command, be prepared to fire on the Firebase." It was a desperate measure, calling artillery fire down on their own position, but it reflected the complete breakdown of organized defense that the sapper assault had achieved in the opening minutes of the attack. For 45 minutes, the sappers sprinted throughout Firebase Mary Ann with the confidence and precision of men who knew exactly where they were going and what they needed to destroy, expertly planting their satchel charges among frantic, befuddled Americans who were still trying to understand what was happening and organize any kind of coherent defense. Throughout Firebase Mary Ann, unprepared Americans were being shot and blown apart by sappers who seemed to know precisely where to concentrate their assault. The command posts, the communications bunkers, the artillery positions, the ammunition storage areas, all the critical nodes that would prevent the defenders from mounting an effective counterattack. Wearing nothing but shorts, the sappers killed 30 GIs and wounded 82 others, with many of the battalion's casualties concentrated among units positioned along the gently sloping side of the base, where the terrain made an infiltration easier. Some soldiers were killed in their beds, stabbed or shot before they could even wake up fully and understand that they were under attack. Others, who tried to exit their bunkers, were gunned down by bursts of automatic weapons fire. Still others were immobilized by clouds of CS, tear gas, that the sappers had distributed throughout the Firebase. Despite the overwhelming surprise and the devastating effectiveness of the sapper assault, there were individual acts of courage and resistance throughout Firebase Mary Ann as American soldiers, once they understood what was happening, began to fight back with whatever weapons they could find and whatever defensive positions they could establish. Members of G Battery, 55th Field Artillery, manning a Quad 50 anti-aircraft position, fought hard during the siege, despite the first mortar fire being well centered on their living quarters and ammunition bunker, with exploding 50 caliber rounds and mortar fire, keeping them briefly pinned down until they could recover and make their way to their fighting positions, only to have sappers begin throwing satchel charges into the bunker, forcing the gun crew, burned and wounded by debris, to fight their way out to the trenches and their weapon, where they could finally bring effective fire against the attackers. Captain Spilberg, despite 3 grenade fragments embedded in his back, picked up a damaged M16 rifle he found on the ground and made his way toward Captain Knight's company command post to see if the company commander had survived. But when he reached the CP, he found it was a bonfire beginning to collapse, with ammunition exploding in the flames. And when he peered inside, he saw only a blazing vision of hell with no sign of life. Somewhere within that inferno, Captain Richard Foch Knight lay dead, killed in the brilliantly executed sapper assault that had targeted the command and control nodes first to prevent any organized defense. Lieutenant Colonel Doyle, realizing that the Tactical Operations Center was being overrun and that communications were failing, grabbed the radio handset and informed the Fire Support Coordination Center at LZ Mildred that they were being forced to evacuate the TOC and would temporarily lose radio contact. And then he and the handful of soldiers still able to fight began carrying radio equipment and the wounded toward the Firebase aid station, fighting their way through the chaos and flames, while sappers continued to move through the base, destroying anything and everything that could offer resistance. Doyle managed to reach the north exit and started to aim his M16 at a couple of infiltrators outside the bunker, but a third unseen enemy soldier threw a grenade at him that landed at his feet and exploded as he turned to head back inside, blowing him down the stairs. The battalion commander was wounded but alive, though his ability to command had been effectively neutralized by the destruction of his Tactical Operations Center and the disruption of his communications network. A Nighthawk Huey helicopter appeared over the base at around 03:25 and began firing on some sappers who were exfiltrating through the wire, cutting down several with minigun fire, but by that time the main attack had largely subsided and the damage had been done. By approximately 03:30 on the morning of March 28th, the sappers began their withdrawal from Firebase Mary Ann, melting back through the concertina wire as silently and efficiently as they had come, dragging their dead and wounded comrades with them to prevent American forces from determining the full extent of enemy casualties, a standard North Vietnamese practice that often left U.S. commanders uncertain about the effectiveness of their defensive fire. The battle took approximately 45 minutes from start to finish, and by the time the attack ended, 30 U.S. soldiers had been killed and 82 wounded, making it the deadliest assault of the Vietnam War on a single U.S. firebase. The official NVA casualty count was uncertain, with 15 bodies left behind in the aftermath of the attack, and blood trails and drag marks indicating that the enemy may have suffered additional casualties that were successfully retrieved by the withdrawing force, though the true number would never be known. As dawn broke on March 28th, the survivors of Firebase Mary Ann emerged from their bunkers and trenches to survey a scene of utter devastation, thick black body bags stacked outside sleeping quarters containing soldiers who had been knifed to death in their beds or blown apart by satchel charges, the centrally located command post and communications bunkers reduced to smoking rubble, bunkers still burning with ammunition cooking off inside, sending occasional bullets and explosions across the firebase. and everywhere the smell of cordite burning wood, melted plastic, and death that no amount of time would ever fully erase from the memories of those who experienced it. The morning after the attack brought a convoy of helicopters carrying investigators, medical personnel, and replacement troops to Firebase Marianne, and also brought reporters and photographers who documented the carnage and the obvious failures that had allowed it to happen. At 1600 on March 29th, the day after the attack, the enemy hit the ruins of Marianne with 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire from a ridgeline to the north, sweeping the enclosure and wounding one additional soldier, a final insult that emphasized how vulnerable the Firebase remained and how completely its defensive capabilities had been destroyed in a single night's action. A soldier who had been attached to G Battery, 55th ADA, Quad 50, and had been on the Firebase for about 1 week following a reassignment with less than 2 weeks remaining of an 18-month tour, was notified by the Red Cross on the afternoon of March 28th of a family death back home and left immediately for emergency leave, never to return, leaving behind everything he owned, all his possessions destroyed and burning in what used to be his quarters, taking with him only the soiled and tired uniform he was wearing and memories of the worst night of his life. The return flight to Chulai that afternoon was pregnant with silence as everyone tried to process what they had witnessed, with 1971 being a benign time in the war, when there had been no major operations near Marianne for the previous 6 months, and the base was being turned over to the ARVN as part of a grand get the U.S. the hell out of Vietnam strategy called Vietnamization. The attack on Firebase Marianne shattered any illusions that the war was winding down peacefully, or that American forces could relax their vigilance even for a moment, and it exposed the rot that had infected parts of the American military in Vietnam by demonstrating with brutal clarity what happened when discipline collapsed and leadership failed at multiple levels of command. The investigation that followed the disaster at Firebase Marianne was as devastating as the attack itself, with findings that traced failures all the way up through the chain of command to the division level, revealing systemic problems in leadership, training, discipline, and basic military competence throughout the Americal Division. Keith William Nolan, in his definitive account of the battle, based on interviews with survivors and recently declassified documents, reconstructed the assault from start to finish, showing how a demoralized American unit was crushed despite the heroic actions of a few individuals, and traced the chain of command process by which the defeat ruined the careers of the division and battalion commanders. The MACV Inspector General's findings were particularly damning, officially concluding that the NVA had simply outperformed their opponents, that leadership at Marianne had been slipshod and unprofessional, and that most American casualties could have been avoided had soldiers behaved like soldiers and officers enforced even the most basic security protocols required for a firebase in hostile territory. The report detailed a litany of failures, perimeter bunkers unmanned or occupied by soldiers who were asleep or intoxicated, trip flares in the concertina wire not reset or replaced when they malfunctioned, no armed guards posted at critical command and control nodes, despite explicit brigade policy requiring such security. No listening posts or observation posts established outside the perimeter to provide early warning of enemy approach, and a general atmosphere of complacency and indiscipline that had infected the unit. 6 high-ranking field grade and flag officers, up to and including the division's commanding general, were relieved of duty and officially reprimanded following the shitstorm of March 28, 1971, and it hastened the pullout of U.S. troops and sounded the sorry end note for the American Division, sent home and disbanded eight months later. Major General James L. Baldwin, commander of the 23rd Infantry Division, was reassigned and received a letter of admonishment, with many in the Army believing that Baldwin, who was otherwise a competent officer, would not have been fired had he been in any other division. But the American Division's name had been eternally tarnished 3 years earlier by the My Lai massacre, and the attack on Firebase Marianne provided final proof that something was fundamentally wrong with the division's leadership and culture. Colonel William S. Hathaway, commander of the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, who had been selected for brigadier general, was instead demoted to lieutenant colonel despite having visited Firebase Marianne on March 27th, the day before the attack, and stating afterward that what he had seen was a big improvement over what I had seen before. The troops were alert, a judgment that the attack would prove catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Colonel William P. Doyle also received a letter of reprimand that effectively ended his career, despite his efforts to maintain discipline and his personal courage during the attack when he was wounded while trying to organize a defense. Doyle remarried in April 1972, just 2 weeks before receiving his letter of reprimand from Army Chief of Staff General William Westmoreland, cut his honeymoon short in order to make a personal but futile appeal to Westmoreland, developed a severe drinking problem, and died of a heart attack in March 1984 at age 52, with Captain Spilberg among those following his caisson to the gravesite at Arlington National Cemetery, and referring to Doyle in the funeral oration as the last casualty of Firebase Marianne. After the attack, the South Vietnamese decided they did not want to garrison Firebase Marianne, perhaps because they understood better than the Americans just how vulnerable and indefensible the position really was, and the firebase was officially closed and abandoned on April 24, 1971, less than a month after the catastrophe, the bunkers and trenches left to be reclaimed by the jungle, the ridge returning to nature as if American forces had never been there at all. The legacy of Firebase. Marianne is complex, uncomfortable, and enduringly relevant more than 50 years after the attack, serving as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of military complacency and a window into the broader crisis that had infected the American military in Vietnam during the final years of U.S. involvement in the war. A horrid bookend with My Lai, the sneak attack at Marianne, was an unruly wake-up call for every soldier in Vietnam, as well as to the higher-up brass and the country as a whole, and to the knowledge of one survivor. The Army's after-action photos were never released. For the survivors, men who carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives, the memory of that night never faded, never softened with time, never became just another war story. One survivor's brother, Joe Neal, was there on the night of the attack with his best friend, another guy named Joe, and they made it out. Though the attack affected Joe for many years, and he only talked about it in the last 5 or 6 years, with a reunion held in Columbus, Georgia every year for those who were part of the American Division that was there. Survivors who read Keith Nolan's definitive account, Sappers in the Wire, found that it really opened their eyes to what they and all the guys went through, with the book describing compassionately the inevitable command relief following the event, in which not only the battalion commander Doyle, but also the brigade commander Colonel Hathaway, and even the 23rd Division commander Major General James Baldwin were sacrificed to atone for the loss. One survivor, who received a Bronze Star for valor during the defense of Firebase, Mary Ann, attended reunions every year wearing a Mary Ann t-shirt with the names of fallen brothers printed on the back, maintaining bonds forged in that terrible night when everything went wrong and only personal courage and individual acts of resistance stood between complete annihilation and survival. For the American military as an institution, Firebase Mary Ann became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in Vietnam, not just the strategic failures and questionable war aims, but the breakdown in basic military discipline, training, and leadership that occurred when soldiers no longer believed in their mission and officers no longer insisted on standards. Colonel Robert D. Henney, Jr., in an Armed Forces Journal editorial on June 7, 1971, cited "The morale plagued a miracle" as an example of how the discipline and battle-worthiness of the U.S. Armed Forces are, with a few salient exceptions, lower and worse than at any time in this century, and possibly in the history of the United States. Movie director Brian De Palma put an American shoulder patch on characters played by Kevin J. Fox and others in Casualties of War, a film based on the true-life story of the kidnapping, rape, and murder of a young Vietnamese woman by U.S. soldiers, and ironically, another sordid chapter of the Americas' horrid history came to a close exactly one day after the Mary Ann attack, when on March 29, 1971, a jury convicted Lieutenant William Calley of premeditated murder for his command of the massacre at My Lai 3 years earlier. The battle demonstrated with brutal clarity what happened when an army abandoned the fundamentals of soldiering, perimeter security, defensive preparation, command and control, mutual support, and the countless other details that separate a military force from an armed mob. For historians and military professionals studying counterinsurgency warfare, fire-based defense, and the challenges of maintaining military effectiveness in an unpopular war, Firebase Mary Ann offers lessons that remain relevant. The importance of enforcing basic security measures even when they seem unnecessary. The danger of allowing unit cohesion and discipline to erode regardless of external circumstances. The critical need for leaders at all levels to maintain standards and hold subordinates accountable. And the recognition that military effectiveness depends not just on weapons, tactics, and training, but on discipline, leadership, morale, and a shared sense of purpose. The human dimension of Firebase. Mary Ann, the 30 American families who received telegrams informing them that their sons or husbands had been killed, the 82 soldiers who came home with wounds, both visible and invisible, the survivors who carry guilt and anger and trauma for the rest of their lives, cannot be reduced to statistics or lessons learned, but must be remembered as individual tragedies that were made worse by being preventable, by the knowledge that better leadership and better discipline could have changed the outcome. One survivor wrote that Firebase Mary Ann and bases like it were where the war got fought, the lonely and frightening places hacked out of the jungle and expected to defend themselves deep in enemy territory, often undermanned and crudely fortified, always in danger of being overrun, and the thought of all those men dying as the night lit up in flames and explosions all around them, with no way to save themselves, their worst and final fears come true, made his blood cold and robbed him of sleep decades later, because they died alone in horror and pain, and their sacrifice must never be forgotten, even though the circumstances of their deaths raised questions about leadership and responsibility that remain painful to confront. There was also a side of medal-winning valor and heroism displayed by individual soldiers who fought back against overwhelming odds when the command structure had collapsed, men who grabbed whatever weapons they could find and fought from whatever positions they could establish, buying time for wounded comrades to be evacuated and preventing the disaster from becoming an even greater catastrophe. The artillery crews who fought their way to their guns despite wounds, the soldiers who maintained their positions and provided covering fire for retreating comrades, the medics who ran through chaos to treat wounded men, the helicopter pilots who flew into the Firebase despite ground fire to evacuate casualties. The story of Firebase Mary Ann is ultimately a story about the price of complacency, the cost of failed leadership, and the human consequences when military organizations forget the fundamentals of their profession. But it is also a story about individual courage, about men who fought back when everything went wrong, and about survivors who carried the memory of their fallen comrades for the rest of their lives, ensuring through their testimony and their annual reunions and their simple refusal to forget that the sacrifice of March 28, 1971 would be remembered and the lessons preserved for future generations.